She locked the door behind her, turned on the generator, and believed she was alone. But when 29-year-old Maya Thornton vanished from a frozen cabin near Whisper Lake, she left behind something that suggested otherwise. A notebook. 5 words. He's still out there watching. 7 years later, her camera was found buried in snow. Maya was not. Before we begin this journey into one of Colorado's most baffling disappearances, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that every missing person deserves to have their story told, that every unanswered question deserves investigation, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Drop a comment below with the word justice, so I know you're here for the right reasons. Your engagement doesn't just help this channel grow. It keeps these cases alive in the public consciousness. It reminds law enforcement that people still care, that families still wait for answers, and that the disappeared are never truly forgotten. Now, let's dive into the mystery of Maya Thornton. It was the second week of January 2012, and the remote mountain town of Ridgefield, Colorado, sat locked in the grip of an early winter storm that had transformed the landscape into something otherworldly. The population of 847 souls had dwindled even further as seasonal residents fled to lower elevations, leaving behind a skeleton crew of year-round locals who knew how to survive when the mountains turned hostile. This was the kind of storm that erased boundaries, where the sky merged with the earth in an endless curtain of gray and white, where visibility dropped to mere feet, and where the world outside your window became an abstract painting of shadow and light. The town itself was little more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered along a 2-lane highway that snaked through the Rockies like a black ribbon. There was a post office that doubled as a community gathering place, a general supply store that had been in the same family for 3 generations, a gas station that closed at 6 in the evening, and a handful of homes scattered along unpaved roads that became impassable when the snow fell heavy. Ridgefield wasn't the kind of place you stumbled upon by accident. You came here because you wanted to disappear, at least temporarily, from the noise and chaos of modern life. You came here for the silence. Maya Thornton had come here for exactly that reason. She was 29 years old, a freelance photographer from Denver, with a growing reputation for capturing landscapes in ways that made viewers feel they were standing in the frame themselves. Her work had been featured in several regional publications, and she'd recently been approached by a gallery in Boulder about a solo exhibition. The pressure to deliver something extraordinary had been building, and Maya had decided she needed complete isolation to create the portfolio piece that would define her career. She'd told her roommate, Jessica Brennan, that she was going off-grid for a week, maybe longer, to a cabin so remote that cell phones became decorative objects and the internet was nothing but a distant memory. Jessica had been hesitant. She'd known Maya for 6 years, ever since they'd met at a coffee shop near the University of Colorado campus, and discovered they were both looking for someone to split rent in the city. Jessica worked as a graphic designer for a marketing firm, and she'd always admired Maya's dedication to her craft. The way she could spend 16 hours straight editing photographs or scouting locations without complaint. But she'd also noticed that Maya had been pushing herself harder lately, taking on more assignments, sleeping less, driven by an ambition that sometimes bordered on obsession. "You're going to be completely alone up there," Jessica had said, as Maya packed her duffel bag in their shared apartment. "No cell service, no neighbors, no way to call for help if something goes wrong." Maya had smiled, that confident smile that made her brown eyes crinkle at the corners. "That's exactly why I'm going," she'd said. "No distractions, No excuses, just me and the landscape. She'd showed Jessica the location on a paper map, an actual paper map, because digital maps didn't have the detail she needed. Whisper Lake was a small body of water tucked into a valley on the eastern slope of the Continental Divide, surrounded by dense pine forest, and accessible only by a single-track road that required four-wheel drive even in good weather. The cabin she'd rented sat on the lake's eastern shore, one of three structures built by a man named Victor Ashford, who'd wanted his own private retreat and had ended up renting them out when his wife passed away, and the silence became too much for him to bear alone. "How did you even find this place?" Jessica had asked, tracing the route with her finger, noting how far it was from anything resembling civilization. "Saw a note on the bulletin board at that vintage camera shop in Boulder," Maya had replied. "Handwritten, kind of old-fashioned. Something about it felt right." That had been typical Maya, following instinct over logic, trusting in serendipity. Jessica had made her promise to check in somehow, even if it meant driving into town every few days to use a payphone. Maya had agreed, though they both knew she probably wouldn't. Once Maya got into her work, the rest of the world ceased to exist. The cabin belonged to Victor Ashford, a retired civil engineer who'd spent 35 years designing bridges for the Colorado Department of Transportation before deciding he'd had enough of deadlines and bureaucracy. He'd purchased 40 acres of mountain property in the late 1990s and built 3 identical A-frame cabins with his own hands, cutting every board, driving every nail, installing every window. They were simple structures, efficient and functional, designed for people who appreciated solitude more than luxury. Each cabin had a single large room with a lofted sleeping area, a kitchenette with a propane stove, a wood-burning fireplace, and windows that offered expansive views of the surrounding wilderness. Ashford rented them through word of mouth only. No website, no booking platforms, no online reviews. Just a phone number written on index cards he posted at select locations around northern Colorado, places where he knew the clientele would appreciate what he was offering. The terms were straightforward. Cash payment up front, no refunds regardless of weather or personal emergency, and a signed waiver acknowledging that the cabins had no cell service, that electricity came from a temperamental generator that required manual starting, that the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away under optimal conditions and potentially unreachable during storms, and that renters assumed all risk for their safety and well-being. Most people thought he was crazy, or paranoid, or both. But Ashford had learned over the years that the people who agreed to his terms were exactly the kind of people he wanted renting his cabins. They were serious about their need for isolation. They understood the risks. They didn't call him at midnight complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi or demanding their money back because a snowstorm had trapped them inside for 3 days. Maya Thornton had called him on a Tuesday afternoon in early January, 2 weeks before her planned arrival. Her voice on the phone had been professional, confident, without the nervous energy that some renters displayed when they realized how remote the location actually was. She'd explained she was a photographer working on a portfolio, that she needed complete silence and uninterrupted time, and that she understood the primitive conditions. Ashford had quoted her his standard rate, $200 per week, and she'd agreed without negotiation. They'd arranged to meet at his workshop in Ridgefield on Saturday morning, January 14th, where she would pay him in cash and he would give her the key, a hand-drawn map, and a brief orientation. Maya had arrived in Ridgefield just before 10 in the morning on that Saturday. The town was already blanketed in 6 inches of fresh snow from an overnight storm, and more was forecast, for later in the week. She'd driven up from Denver in her 2008 Subaru Outback, a vehicle she'd purchased specifically because it could handle mountain roads and harsh weather. The drive had taken just over 3 hours, including a stop for gas and coffee in Fort Collins. Her first destination had been Ridgefield General Supply, a combination hardware store and grocery that occupied a converted barn at the edge of town. The building had weathered wooden siding and a painted sign hanging above the entrance that read, Est, 1947, in faded letters. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust, coffee, and the particular mustiness that comes from decades of accumulated merchandise. The owner, Philip Morse, was 73 years old and had been running the store for 46 years, ever since his father suffered a stroke and could no longer manage the business. Philip knew every regular customer by name and could usually predict what newcomers needed based on how they dressed and what vehicle they drove. When Maya walked through the door that morning, her camera bag slung over her shoulder and snow-dusting the shoulders of her navy parka, he'd pegged her immediately as a cabin renter heading to one of Ashford's properties. "Morning," he'd called from behind the counter, where he'd been sorting through a delivery of batteries. "Storm coming in later this week. You stocking up?" Maya had smiled and nodded, pulling a handwritten list from her pocket. She'd walked through the store methodically, selecting items with the efficiency of someone who'd done their research. Batteries in various sizes, both alkaline and lithium for cold weather performance. 6 cans of soup, 3 cans of chili, a box of granola bars, a bag of trail mix, instant coffee, powdered creamer, sugar packets, a box of emergency candles, waterproof matches, a paperback thriller with a lurid cover showing a woman running through a forest. Philip had watched her shop, noting the quality of her boots, the professional-grade camera bag, the way she checked expiration dates and compared prices. This was someone who took preparation seriously. When she'd brought her selections to the counter, he'd rung them up on a register that was probably older than she was, the keys clacking with each entry. "Heading up to Whisper Lake?" he'd asked, making conversation the way small-town shopkeepers do. "I am," Maya had confirmed. "Renting one of Victor Ashford's cabins for the week." "Beautiful up there," Philip had said. "Peaceful. You'll be totally alone unless the other cabins are rented, which they usually aren't this time of year. Most folks don't want to risk getting snowed in." "That's exactly what I want," Maya had replied. "The peace, I mean. I'm a photographer, working on a series." "Black and white or color?" Philip had asked, nodding toward her camera. "Black and white. Winter landscapes. I want to capture the way light moves through snow, the textures, the absence of color revealing structure." Philip had liked that answer. He'd appreciated people who thought deeply about their work. "The lake freezes completely most years," he'd told her. "Goes right down to the bottom in the coldest stretches. Creates some interesting patterns when the ice shifts." "That's perfect," Maya had said, and he'd heard genuine excitement in her voice. He'd bagged her purchases, and she'd paid in cash, exact change. As she'd turned to leave, she'd paused at the door and looked back. "Is there anything I should know? About the area, I mean. Anything to be careful of?" Philip had considered the question. "Keep your food locked up tight at night. Bears are hibernating this time of year, but you get the occasional one that wakes up confused and hungry. Mountain lions are active year-round, though they usually avoid people. If you hear something outside at night, it's probably just elk or deer. The forest is full of sounds, especially when the wind gets up. First-timers sometimes get spooked by how dark it gets, how complete the silence is. Your mind starts playing tricks." Maya had nodded, absorbing this information without apparent concern. Thank you. I'll be careful. You got a satellite phone? Some kind of emergency beacon? Philip had asked. Victor mentioned the cabins don't have cell service, but I'll be okay. I'm only planning to be up there for 7, maybe 10 days at most. Make sure you tell someone exactly when you'll be back, Philip had advised. Weather up there can change fast. Road can become impassable. You don't want folks worrying unnecessarily. My roommate knows where I am and when to expect me back, Maya had assured him. I'll be fine. And with that, she'd pushed through the door, the bell above it chiming, and walked out into the softly falling snow. Philip had watched through the window as she'd loaded her purchases into the back of her Subaru, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled away, heading north toward the mountain road that would take her to Whisper Lake. The entire interaction had been captured by the store's security camera, a relatively new addition that Philip's insurance company had required after a break-in 3 years earlier. The footage showed Maya from multiple angles as she shopped, clear images of her face, her clothing, the items she selected. The timestamp in the corner of the frame read 10:23 a.m., January 14th, 2012. That footage would be analyzed frame by frame in the weeks and months to come. Investigators would watch it hundreds of times, looking for anything unusual in Maya's demeanor, any sign of distress or fear, any indication that she knew something was wrong. But every viewing would reveal the same thing. A young woman, calm and confident, preparing for a solo trip into the wilderness with no apparent concern for her safety. From Ridgefield General Supply, Maya had driven to Victor Ashford's workshop, a converted garage behind his house on the southern edge of town. Ashford had been waiting for her, standing outside despite the cold, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He was 68 years old, tall and lean, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. His hands were scarred from decades of construction work, his movements economical and precise. "You must be Maya," he'd said, as she'd parked and climbed out of her car. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality." They'd shaken hands, and Maya had followed him into the workshop where a space heater fought a losing battle against the cold. The interior was organized chaos, tools hanging from pegboards, lumber stacked along the walls, a workbench covered in various projects in different stages of completion. On the bench sat a metal lockbox containing keys and documents. Ashford had pulled out a folder with her name written on the tab. Inside were several pages: a rental agreement, liability waiver, property rules, and a hand-drawn map showing the route to the cabin and the layout of the property. He'd gone through each document methodically, pointing out important details. "The generator is in a shed behind the cabin," he'd explained. "Instructions are posted inside. It's got enough fuel for about 3 days of continuous use if you're running lights and the space heater. Use it sparingly and it'll last longer. The fireplace is your primary heat source. There's firewood stacked on the porch, enough for 2 weeks if you're conservative. The well pump works manually, but the handle is stiff. You'll need both hands and some body weight to get it going, especially if the mechanism is partially frozen." Maya had listened carefully, asking clarifying questions, taking notes on a small pad she'd pulled from her camera bag. "The nearest cabin is about half a mile west through the trees," Ashford had continued. "It's not rented right now, so you'll have complete privacy. The third cabin is another mile beyond that, also vacant. In winter, I rarely have more than one cabin occupied at a time. People either love extreme isolation or they don't. There's not much middle ground." "I'm definitely in the first category," Maya had said. Ashford had nodded approvingly. "The road up to the lake is maintained by the county until you reach the turnoff, Then it's a Forest Service road for about 2 miles. Then it becomes my private access road for the last mile and a half. That last stretch is rough even in good weather. I graded it in the fall, but winter takes a toll. You've got 4-wheel drive? Yes, and new all-terrain tires. Good. You should be fine then, at least for the next few days. But there's a storm system moving in Thursday or Friday. Could be significant accumulation. If you're planning to stay through it, make sure you're prepared. If it gets bad, that access road will be impassable until I can get up there with the plow. And that might not be immediately if the county roads are also blocked. I'm prepared to stay longer if necessary, Maya had assured him. Actually, I'd prefer it. The isolation is the whole point. Ashford had studied her for a moment, and when he'd spoken again, his tone had been more serious. I need to be straight with you. You're going to be very alone up there. There's no cell service, no internet, no way to call for help if something goes wrong. The satellite phone in the cabin is for absolute emergencies only, and even that might not work in heavy weather. You need to be completely self-sufficient. If you get injured, if you get sick, if something happens, you're on your own until you can make it back to town or until I come to check on you. I understand, Maya had said. I've done solo wilderness camping before. I know the risks. This is different from camping. You'll be in a structure, which means you might let your guard down more than you would in a tent. You might take risks you wouldn't take in the backcountry. I've had people do stupid things because they felt safe, and then they weren't. I'll be careful, Maya had promised. Ashford had seemed satisfied with her responses. He'd had her sign the paperwork, collected $400 in cash for 2 weeks, the maximum rental period, and given her the key, a simple brass key on a wooden keychain with Cabin 1 burned into it. He'd also given her his business card with his phone number. I don't expect to hear from you unless there's an emergency, he'd said. But if you need something, if something goes wrong, you can drive into town and call me from the payphone at the gas station. I'll come up if necessary. Your rental period ends on Saturday, January 21st. If you want to stay longer and the cabin's not booked, which it won't be, just come find me and we'll settle up. Otherwise, I'll expect you to return the key by noon on the 21st. Understood, Maya had said, pocketing the key. One more thing, Ashford had added. Sometimes people see lights in the forest at night. Headlamps from hunters or hikers. Reflections off animal eyes. Sometimes just tricks of the moonlight on snow. Don't let it spook you. The forest is full of wildlife, and occasionally you get people passing through even in winter. But no one should be on my property without permission. If someone knocks on your door, if someone tries to get your attention, use your judgment. You're not obligated to open the door or engage with anyone. Maya had found this advice slightly ominous, but she'd nodded. Has that happened before? Someone showing up at the cabins? A few times over the years. Usually it's hikers who got lost or hunters tracking wounded game. Once it was a couple whose car broke down and they were looking for help. I just want you to know you don't have to play host if you don't want to. Your safety comes first. Got it. Thank you. And with that, Maya had left the workshop, climbed back into her Subaru, and began the journey up the mountain toward Whisper Lake. The drive took just over 90 minutes. The first portion, along the county highway, was relatively smooth, the pavement clear thanks to regular plowing. But once she'd turned onto the Forest Service road, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The road narrowed, winding through dense stands of pine and fir, climbing steadily. Snow had accumulated in deeper layers here. the road merely a compressed track through white wilderness. The turnoff to Ashford's access road was marked by a weathered wooden post with private property burned into it. Maya had engaged her four-wheel drive and descended into a valley, the road becoming more primitive, barely more than parallel ruts with a strip of undisturbed snow between them. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches heavy with snow, creating a tunnel effect that blocked out much of the daylight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of crawling along at 10 miles per hour, the forest opened up and Whisper Lake came into view. It was smaller than Maya had expected, perhaps a quarter-mile across, its surface frozen solid and covered in a pristine layer of snow that made it indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape, except for the absence of trees. The cabin sat about 50 yards back from the shore, a compact A-frame structure with dark wood siding and large windows facing the water. Smoke would have been rising from the chimney if anyone had been there recently, but now it stood silent and cold, waiting. Maya parked next to the cabin and sat for a moment in the car, engine running, taking in the scene. The silence was profound. No traffic noise, no aircraft, no human sounds of any kind. Just wind moving through the trees and the occasional crack of ice shifting on the lake. It was exactly what she'd been looking for. She spent the next hour unloading her car and settling into the cabin. The interior was as Ashford had described, functional and sparse. The main room contained a small kitchenette along one wall, a table with 2 chairs near the window, a worn couch positioned in front of the fireplace, and a ladder leading up to a sleeping loft. The bathroom was barely large enough to turn around in, with a composting toilet and a sink connected to the well pump. The shower consisted of a gravity-fed bag that could be heated on the stove and hung from a hook. Maya had unpacked systematically. Her clothes went into a small dresser in the loft. Her photography equipment, multiple camera bodies, several lenses, a tripod, filters, cleaning supplies, occupied the table. Her food and supplies went into the kitchenette. She'd brought a battery-powered lantern and several headlamps for light. Her phone, useless without service, went into her bag where it would stay for the duration of her trip. Once settled, she'd started a fire in the fireplace using kindling and logs from the porch. The wood was dry and caught easily, filling the cabin with warmth and the pleasant scent of burning pine. She'd made herself coffee on the propane stove and stood at the window, looking out at the frozen lake and the forest beyond, feeling the tension of the past months beginning to drain away. This was going to be good. This was going to be exactly what she needed. For the next 2 days, Maya fell into a routine that felt both productive and meditative. She would wake with the dawn, which came late and gray in these mountains in January. She would light the fire that had burned down to embers overnight, make coffee, eat a simple breakfast. Then she would dress in her warmest layers, pack her camera bag, and head out into the landscape. She photographed the lake from every angle, experimenting with different lenses and exposure settings. She captured the texture of snow on tree bark, the patterns of frozen water at the lake's edge, the way light filtered through ice crystals. She hiked into the forest, following game trails, finding compositions that spoke to the isolation and stark beauty of winter wilderness. She worked methodically, professionally, losing herself in the technical challenges and creative decisions. In the evenings, she would return to the cabin as the light failed, review her work on her camera's LCD screen, make notes in a leather-bound notebook she carried specifically for this purpose. She would heat soup or chili on the stove, eat while watching the darkness deepen outside the windows, then spend time by the fire, reading the paperback thriller she'd purchased, or simply sitting in silence, letting her mind rest. On her second night, January 15th, she'd written in her notebook, "The silence here is not empty. It's full of small sounds you never notice when there's background noise to drown them out. The cabin settling, wood contracting in the cold, wind finding gaps in the walls, a low whistle that could almost be mistaken for breath. The fire consuming wood with small pops and cracks. I can hear my own heartbeat if I hold still enough. This is what I needed." Absolute presence in the moment. But on the third night, something changed. Maya had been reading on the couch, wrapped in a sleeping bag, the fire burning low, when she heard it. A sound from outside. Footsteps, crunching in the snow. Distinctive, rhythmic, the sound of someone walking around the perimeter of the cabin. She'd frozen, book forgotten in her lap, listening. The steps continued, slow and deliberate, not the random pattern of an animal, but the measured pace of a person. They seemed to circle the cabin, passing along the front near the windows, moving around to the side she couldn't see, then appearing on the other side. Round and round, never stopping, never approaching the door, just circling. Maya had stood slowly, moving to the window, but she'd left the fire burning and the interior lights on, which meant all she could see was her own reflection in the glass. Outside was absolute darkness. She'd turned off the lamp on the side table, waited for her eyes to adjust. Looked again. Nothing visible. Just blackness, and her own face ghosted in the window. The footsteps had continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Then they'd stopped. Complete silence returned. Maya had waited, heart pounding, listening for any additional sound. Nothing. She'd gone to the door, which was locked, and checked it. Solid. She'd checked the windows, all closed, latched. She'd stood in the center of the cabin, trying to decide what to do. Should she open the door and call out? Should she grab her flashlight and investigate? Or should she simply return to the couch and try to convince herself it had been an animal, even though every instinct told her it hadn't been? In the end, she'd chosen caution. She'd added wood to the fire, creating light and warmth and the psychological comfort of flame. She'd positioned herself on the couch where she could see both the door and the main window, and she'd stayed awake long into the night, listening. But the footsteps didn't return. In the morning, she'd dressed quickly and gone outside to examine the area around the cabin. The snow from 2 days earlier had been partially melted by an afternoon of sun and then refrozen overnight, creating a crusty surface. She'd searched for footprints, but found nothing conclusive. There were disturbed areas in the snow, but whether they were from an animal, a person, or simply the result of wind and ice, she couldn't determine. She'd stood in the clearing, looking toward the tree line, feeling exposed and uncertain. The forest looked back at her, impassive and silent. If someone had been there, they were gone now. If it had been an animal, it had moved on. The rational part of her brain argued for the animal explanation. Elk, maybe, or a deer. They were large enough to make sounds that could be mistaken for human footsteps, especially if you were alone in the dark with an active imagination. But another part of her, a more primal part, wasn't convinced. The pattern had been too regular, too deliberate, and there had been something about the pacing, the way the sounds had circled and circled, that felt intentional, purposeful. Maya had gone back inside and written in her notebook. Heard something outside the window last night. sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. Checked this morning but can't find clear prints. Probably an animal. But it didn't sound like an animal. She'd spent that day, January 16th, close to the cabin, photographing the immediate area, trying to shake the unease that had settled over her. The landscape that had felt beautifully isolated 2 days ago now felt exposed, vulnerable. She'd found herself glancing over her shoulder repeatedly, scanning the tree line, looking for movement that never came. That evening, she'd considered packing up and leaving. She had enough photographs for her portfolio. She could return to Denver, develop the work in the comfort and safety of her apartment, and tell herself she'd accomplished what she'd set out to do, but something stopped her. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. The unwillingness to let fear drive her away from a place she'd specifically chosen for its isolation. She'd come here to push herself, to sit with discomfort, to create art from solitude. Running away after one strange night felt like failure. So she'd stayed. But she'd taken precautions. She'd moved the fireplace poker closer to the couch where she slept. She'd positioned her largest flashlight within easy reach. She'd checked and rechecked that the door was locked, that the windows were secure. And when darkness fell, she'd kept the fire burning brighter than necessary, wasting wood but buying peace of mind. The fourth night, January 17th, the sounds had returned. This time she'd been prepared, or as prepared as one could be. She'd positioned herself at the table with her back to the wall, her notebook open in front of her, trying to write, trying to focus on describing the photographs she'd taken that day. But her attention had been divided, part of her mind listening for any sound from outside. When the footsteps came, she'd been ready with a flashlight. She'd moved quickly to the window, flashlight off, looking out into darkness. Then she'd flicked it on, the beam lancing out into the night, illuminating trees and snow and the edge of the frozen lake. Nothing. No person, no animal, nothing visible in the cone of light. But the footsteps continued, and they were definitely footsteps. She was certain now they were on the side of the cabin, where there were no windows, moving along the wall. She'd crossed the room, trying to follow the sound, but by the time she'd reached the other window, the steps had moved again, always staying just out of sight. She'd stood in the center of the cabin, flashlight gripped tight, her heart hammering. This wasn't an animal. This was someone. Someone who knew she was alone. Someone who was deliberately staying out of sight, circling, watching, waiting for what? Maya had gone to the door, had put her hand on the lock. Part of her wanted to throw it open, to confront whoever was out there, to demand they identify themselves. But another part, the part connected to every instinct honed by millions of years of human evolution, told her that opening that door would be the worst mistake she could make. So she'd stayed inside, and the footsteps had continued for longer this time, maybe 20 minutes, a slow, patient circling that felt like a test, like a predator assessing prey, looking for weakness, waiting for an opportunity. When the sounds finally stopped, Maya had sunk onto the couch, shaking. She'd waited in silence for another hour, listening, but whoever or whatever had been out there didn't return. She'd opened her notebook with trembling hands and written, "He's still out there watching. Not it, not something." She'd written he because somewhere in the past 2 nights, she'd become convinced that this was a person, a man, someone who meant her harm. She'd torn that page out of the notebook, the warning written in all capital letters, and she'd tucked it into the back pocket of the book, a message to her future self or to whoever might find the notebook later. Evidence. Documentation. Proof that she'd known something was wrong. That night, Maya hadn't slept. She'd kept the fire burning, had kept a flashlight in her hand, had watched the door and windows until dawn broke gray and cold over the frozen lake. When there was finally enough light to see by, she'd made a decision. She needed to leave. But first, she needed to document what had happened. As a photographer, documentation was instinct. She'd gone outside into the cold morning, camera in hand, and she'd photographed everything. The cabin from every angle, the surrounding snow, the tree line, the areas where she thought the footsteps had been. She'd taken detailed shots and wide shots, creating a visual record that would show investigators exactly what the scene looked like. Then she'd gone back inside, packed her most essential items into her messenger bag: the camera, her notebook, her wallet and identification, some food, the keys to her car. She'd put on her parka and her boots, and she'd opened the door, intending to walk directly to her Subaru and drive away from this place as fast as the road would allow. But her car wouldn't start. She'd turned the key in the ignition, and nothing had happened. Not even a click. The battery was completely dead, or something else was wrong, something beyond her ability to diagnose or repair. Maya had sat in the driver's seat, key in hand, staring at the dashboard in disbelief. The car had been fine 3 days ago. She'd driven it up here without any problems. She'd checked the lights multiple times to make sure she hadn't left anything on that would drain the battery. This shouldn't be happening. Unless someone had sabotaged it. The thought had hit her like a physical blow. Someone had been circling the cabin for 2 nights. Someone who'd stayed carefully out of sight. Someone who knew she was alone. And now her only means of escape was disabled. She'd gotten out of the car and stood in the clearing, looking around wildly. The forest seemed to press closer, the trees leaning in, the silence now menacing rather than peaceful. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Maya had forced herself to think rationally. She had options. The satellite phone in the cabin. Ashford had said it was for emergencies, and this absolutely qualified. She could call him, or call the sheriff, or call anyone, and get help. She'd run back inside, her messenger bag bouncing against her hip, and she'd found the satellite phone mounted on the wall near the door. She'd picked up the handset, expecting a dial tone, but she'd been met with silence. She'd pressed buttons, had tried hanging up and trying again, but the phone was dead. Either the battery was depleted, or the service had been disconnected, or the equipment had failed, or it had been cut. Maya had dropped the handset and backed away from it like it was dangerous. Her mind was racing now, panic starting to override rational thought. She was alone, isolated, with no working vehicle, no working phone, no way to call for help, and someone knew, someone was out there, watching, waiting. She'd grabbed her messenger bag and made another decision. She would walk out. The road to town was long, probably 8 or 9 miles total, but it was marked. It was a clear route, and if she moved fast, she could reach the highway before dark. From there, she could flag down a passing car or walk to the nearest house. Maya had stepped outside, had oriented herself toward the access road, and she'd started walking. The snow was deep in places, the frozen crust sometimes supporting her weight, sometimes breaking through to dump her knee-deep in powder. Progress was slow, exhausting, but she'd pushed forward, driven by fear and determination. She'd made it perhaps half a mile, maybe less, when she'd heard something in the forest behind her. The unmistakable sound of someone moving through the trees, paralleling her course, staying just out of sight, but close enough that she could hear branches breaking, snow crunching. Maya had stopped, had turned to look, but the forest was too dense, the shadows too deep. She'd called out, her voice sounding thin and small in the vastness of the wilderness. "Who's there? I know you're following me. Show yourself." No response. Just the continuing sound of movement, steady and deliberate, keeping pace with her. She'd started moving again, faster now, pushing through the snow with desperate energy, her breath coming in ragged gasps that formed clouds in the frigid air. The messenger bag banged against her ribs with each step. Her boots, which had seemed so adequate in the store, were now letting in moisture, her feet growing cold and clumsy. The sounds in the forest had continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there, a presence she couldn't shake. And then, after perhaps another quarter-mile of this terrifying pursuit, the sounds had stopped completely. Maya had frozen in place, listening, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The silence was worse than the sounds had been. Where had he gone? Was he ahead of her now, waiting? Was he behind her, closing the distance while she stood still? She'd forced herself to keep moving, but every step felt like a mistake. The forest pressed in on all sides, the road just a narrow corridor through endless trees. The sky overhead was gray, threatening more snow, the light already starting to fade, though it couldn't have been later than 3 in the afternoon. Maya had walked for another hour, maybe more. Time becoming difficult to track when fear compressed every second into something that felt both eternal and fleeting. She'd been watching the forest, watching for movement, watching for any sign of the person who'd been following her when she'd made a mistake. She'd stepped wrong, her boot coming down on a section of ice hidden beneath the snow, and her ankle had twisted violently. Pain had shot up her leg, sharp and immediate, and she'd fallen hard, landing on her side, her messenger bag cushioning her fall, but also driving the breath from her lungs. She'd lain there for a moment, gasping, pain radiating from her ankle. When she'd tried to stand, the ankle had buckled, unable to support her weight. She'd managed to get to her feet by using a nearby tree for support, but walking was now excruciating, each step sending fresh waves of pain through her leg. Maya had looked back the way she'd come, then forward along the road toward town. She'd covered maybe a mile, perhaps a mile and a half at most. That left 7 or 8 miles still to go, and she was injured, exhausted, and the light was failing. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening approached, and she wasn't dressed for an extended period outside. Her parka was warm, but it was designed for activity, not for surviving a night in sub-zero conditions. She'd had to make a choice. Try to continue forward on a damaged ankle, knowing she wouldn't make it to town before dark, and might not make it at all, or return to the cabin where at least she had fire and shelter. It had been an impossible decision. The cabin meant going back toward whatever had been in the forest, back toward the person who'd circled the building for 2 nights, back toward danger. But continuing forward meant almost certain exposure and hypothermia, death from cold rather than whatever other death might await her at the cabin. In the end, survival instinct had won. She'd turned around, had begun the agonizing journey back to the cabin, limping heavily, using trees for support, her ankle screaming with each step. The walk back had taken twice as long as the walk out. By the time the cabin came into view, full darkness had fallen, and Maya was near the end of her endurance. Her injured ankle had swollen inside her boot, the pain now a constant throb that made her nauseous. She was shivering uncontrollably, her layers of clothing soaked with sweat that was now freezing against her skin. She'd made it to the door, had fumbled with the key with fingers that barely worked, and had finally gotten inside. The fire had burned down to cold ashes hours ago, and the interior of the cabin was barely warmer than outside. She'd known she needed to start a new fire immediately, that hypothermia was a real and present danger, but first she'd locked the door behind her, had pushed the table against it for additional security, had checked every window to ensure they were latched. Only then had she turned her attention to survival. She'd gathered kindling with shaking hands, had arranged it in the fireplace, had struck match after match before finally getting one to light. The kindling had caught. She'd added small pieces of wood, then larger ones, coaxing the fire back to life. As warmth began to fill the cabin, she'd stripped off her wet clothes, had wrapped herself in every blanket she could find, and had collapsed on the couch. Her ankle was badly swollen, already showing dark bruising. She'd elevated it on the arm of the couch, had taken ibuprofen from a first aid kit she'd brought, and had tried to assess her situation rationally. She was trapped. Her car didn't work. The phone didn't work. She was injured and couldn't walk out. The nearest help was miles away, and no one was expecting her back in Denver for several more days. Jessica thought she'd be at the cabin until at least the 21st. Victor Ashford wouldn't come to check on her until she failed to return the key. That was 3, almost 4 days away. 4 days alone with whoever was out there in the forest. Maya had lain on the couch as the fire warmed the cabin, as the pain in her ankle settled into a steady, manageable throb, and she'd tried to form a plan. She had food enough for several days. She had water from the well. She had firewood. She could survive in the cabin for 4 days if she had to. She just had to stay inside, keep the door locked, wait for Ashford to come. But what if whoever was out there didn't wait? What if they came for her tonight? She'd pushed that thought away. She had to focus on what she could control. Fire, water, food, rest. Those were the fundamentals of survival. Everything else was speculation. Maya had spent that night, January 18th, on the couch, dozing fitfully, waking at every sound real or imagined. The fire had burned low several times, and each time she'd forced herself to get up, to limp across the cabin, to add more wood. She couldn't let the fire go out. The cold would kill her as surely as anything else. Morning had come eventually, gray light filtering through the windows. She'd made coffee, had eaten some granola bars, had assessed her ankle. The swelling had gone down slightly, but it was still painful to walk on. She'd fashioned a crude wrap using an elastic bandage from her first aid kit, and that had helped stabilize it somewhat. She'd spent the day keeping the fire going, rationing her food, trying to rest and let her ankle heal. She'd stayed away from the windows as much as possible, not wanting to be visible from outside, not wanting whoever was out there to know her movements or her state. That night, January 19th, the sounds had returned. But this time they were different. Not footsteps circling the cabin, but something else. Scratching at the walls. A sound like someone dragging a stick or a branch along the wooden siding, slow and deliberate. It would start on one side of the cabin, scrape along the wall, then stop. Silence for a few minutes. Then it would start again on another wall. Maya had sat frozen on the couch, listening to this methodical scratching, this deliberate terrorizing, because that's what it was. Someone was trying to frighten her, to break her down psychologically before making whatever move they intended to make. She'd grabbed the fireplace poker, had held it across her lap, her knuckles white on the metal. If they came through the door, if they broke a window, she would fight. She wouldn't go down without fighting. But the scratching had continued for hours, never escalating, never turning into an actual attempt to break in. Just that steady, patient sound of something being dragged along the walls, around and around the cabin. By the time it stopped, probably around midnight, Maya was beyond exhaustion. Her hands were shaking, her mind was fractured, and she knew she was approaching a breaking point. She couldn't sustain this level of fear and stress for 3 more days. Something had to change. In the morning, January 20th, she'd made a decision. She needed to create some kind of record, some kind of evidence that would explain what had happened if she didn't survive. She'd taken her notebook, the one where she'd been recording her thoughts about the photography project, and she'd written out everything that had happened since her arrival. The footsteps on the 3rd night, the circling on the 4th night, her attempt to leave and her injury, the scratching on the walls. She'd written it all down in as much detail as she could manage, including her growing certainty that someone was hunting her, that this wasn't random, that whoever was out there had targeted her specifically. She'd also written a message to her sister, to her parents, telling them she loved them, telling them she'd tried to survive, apologizing for putting herself in this situation. She'd folded these pages carefully and placed them in her messenger bag, along with her camera equipment. If something happened to her, if they found her body eventually, they would also find this documentation. They would know this wasn't an accident, wasn't her getting lost or succumbing to hypothermia through carelessness. They would know someone had done this to her. That afternoon, she'd heard something new. The sound of a vehicle in the distance, an engine laboring up the mountain road. For a moment, hope had surged through her. Was it Ashford? Had he come early? Had someone somehow learned she was in trouble? She'd limped to the window, had looked out toward where the access road emerged from the forest. She'd seen nothing at first, just trees and snow. But the engine sound had grown closer, and then a truck had appeared. Not Ashford's. Something else, something larger and older, black or dark blue, hard to tell in the gray light. The truck had stopped perhaps 100 yards from the cabin, just at the edge of the clearing. The engine had idled for a moment, then shut off. The driver's door had opened, and a figure had climbed out. Maya had watched, barely breathing, as the figure stood beside the truck, looking toward the cabin. It was a man, that much was clear, tall and bulky in winter clothing. He'd stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching the cabin, not approaching, not calling out, just watching. Then he'd reached back into the truck and pulled something out. Even from a distance, Maya had recognized the shape. An axe, a long-handled axe with a broad blade. Terror had flooded through her. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading. He was coming for her, and he was armed, and she had nothing but a fireplace poker and an injured ankle. But the man hadn't approached. Instead, he'd walked to the tree line, had selected a fallen branch, and had begun chopping it into sections. The sound of the axe biting into wood had echoed across the clearing, rhythmic and methodical. Maya had watched in confusion. Was this some kind of psychological game? Was he demonstrating what he could do with that axe? Or was he simply gathering firewood, engaged in some completely innocent activity that had nothing to do with her own. The man had worked for perhaps 15 minutes, cutting the branch into manageable pieces, loading them into the back of his truck. Then he'd climbed back into the cab, had started the engine, and had driven away, back down the access road toward the main Forest Service road. Maya had stood at the window long after the sound of the engine had faded, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. Had that been a threat? A warning? Or had it been exactly what it appeared to be? Someone gathering firewood who happened to be on the same property. She'd wanted to believe the innocent explanation, but everything that had happened over the past several days made that impossible. The coincidence was too great. Someone appears with an axe the same day after nights of harassment? No. That was him. That was the person who'd been circling the cabin, following her, scratching at the walls, and he'd wanted her to see him, to see the axe, to understand that when he decided to come for her, she wouldn't be able to stop him. That night, Maya had barricaded herself as best she could. She'd pushed the couch against the door in addition to the table. She'd wedged chairs under the door handle. She'd piled firewood in front of the windows, not enough to block them completely, but enough to slow anyone trying to climb through. She'd kept the fire burning bright, had kept the fireplace poker within reach, and had tried to stay awake through another long, terrifying night. But the sounds didn't come. Not the footsteps, not the scratching, nothing. Just silence, deep and complete, more unnerving than any sound could have been. By morning, January 21st, the day Ashford expected her to return the key, Maya was barely functional. She'd slept perhaps 3 hours total over the past 3 days. Her ankle was still painful, though marginally better. She was running low on food, down to a few cans of soup and some granola bars. The firewood on the porch was nearly depleted. She'd been burning it faster than necessary, prioritizing warmth and light, and the psychological comfort of flame over conservation. She'd tried the satellite phone again that morning, knowing it was futile but trying anyway. Still dead. She'd gone outside, moving carefully on her injured ankle, and had tried the car one more time. Still wouldn't start. She'd opened the hood, had looked at the engine with untrained eyes, and had seen that one of the battery cables had been disconnected. Not loosened, not corroded, but deliberately removed and tucked away where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Confirmation. Everything that had happened was intentional. Someone had sabotaged her car to trap her here. Someone who'd then spent days terrorizing her, breaking her down, playing with her like a cat with a mouse. Maya had reconnected the battery cable with shaking hands, had tried the ignition again, and this time the engine had turned over. It had started. The car was functional. She could leave. She'd stood beside the idling vehicle, door open, one foot inside, trying to decide. Should she drive straight out, risk the road in her exhausted state, try to make it to town? Or should she wait a few more hours for Ashford, who would come when she didn't return the key, who would have better knowledge of the roads, who would be additional protection against whoever was out there? The decision had been made for her when she'd seen the truck again. The same dark vehicle from the previous day, approaching down the access road, moving slowly, deliberately. Maya had acted on pure instinct. She'd grabbed her messenger bag from inside the cabin, had thrown it into the passenger seat, had climbed behind the wheel, and had put the Subaru in gear. She'd pressed the accelerator, her vehicle lurching forward, snow spraying from the tires. The access road led in only one direction, toward the approaching truck. There was no alternate route, no way to avoid passing it. Maya had gripped the steering wheel, had accelerated as much as she dared on the snow-covered road, and had committed to her escape. The truck had continued approaching, and as the distance closed, Maya had been able to see the driver more clearly. A man, mid-50s perhaps, wearing a heavy coat and a knit cap. His face was weathered, his expression neutral, unreadable. They'd passed each other on the narrow road with only inches to spare. Maya had hunched down in her seat, had avoided eye contact, had just kept driving. In her rearview mirror, she'd seen the truck continue toward the cabin, not stopping, not turning around, just proceeding as if nothing was wrong. She'd driven faster, taking risks on the icy road that she knew were dangerous, but feeling that staying was more dangerous still. The forest had blurred past on either side, the road unreeling before her, and slowly, incrementally, she'd begun to believe she might actually make it out. The access road had connected to the Forest Service Road, which had been in slightly better condition, and that had eventually connected to the county highway. When Maya had finally reached pavement, when she'd felt the tires grip asphalt instead of compressed snow, she'd let out a sob of relief. She'd driven straight through Ridgefield without stopping, had continued south toward Fort Collins, putting as much distance between herself and Whisper Lake as possible. It wasn't until she'd reached the outskirts of Fort Collins, until she'd seen buildings and traffic and people, that she'd finally pulled over at a gas station. She'd sat in the parking lot, engine running, and she'd tried to call Jessica from a payphone, but her hands had been shaking so badly she couldn't get the coins into the slot. A woman passing by had stopped, had asked if she was okay, and Maya had broken down completely. The woman had called an ambulance, and within minutes Maya had been surrounded by paramedics asking questions she couldn't answer coherently. They'd taken her to Medical Center of the Rockies in Loveland, where she'd been treated for a sprained ankle, dehydration, and exhaustion. A social worker had been called, then police, and Maya had tried to tell them what had happened, but even to her own ears it had sounded paranoid, unhinged. Footsteps in the night, scratching on walls. A man with an axe who'd done nothing but chop firewood. A disconnected battery cable that could have been knocked loose by accident or by an animal. The police had been polite but skeptical. They'd taken her statement, had promised to investigate, but she'd seen the glances exchanged between them, the assessment being made. Woman alone in wilderness cabin, isolated, probably let her imagination run wild. Spooked herself. Common enough occurrence. But they had gone up to Whisper Lake eventually, had checked the cabin, and they'd found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of tampering beyond the battery cable which could have been an accident. No footprints preserved in the snow, which had melted and refrozen multiple times. Nothing to substantiate Maya's claims of being hunted, terrorized, trapped. Victor Ashford had been interviewed. He'd confirmed that Maya had rented the cabin, that she'd seemed perfectly normal when he'd met with her, that the terms of the rental had been clearly explained. He'd expressed concern for her well-being and confusion about what had happened. He'd said no one should have been on his property, that he hadn't rented the other cabins, that he had no idea who the man in the truck might have been. Could have been a neighbor accessing their own land through his property, which happened sometimes. Could have been a hunter who'd gotten lost. Could have been anyone. The investigation had stalled almost immediately. No crime had been committed that police could identify. No one was missing. No one was hurt beyond Maya's self-inflicted ankle injury. It had been classified as a mental health crisis rather than a criminal matter, and Maya had been advised to follow up with a therapist. She'd returned to Denver, to her apartment, to Jessica, who'd been frantic with worry, and she'd tried to resume her normal life. But nothing had been normal. She'd been jumpy, paranoid, unable to sleep without nightmares. She'd been convinced that whoever had been at Whisper Lake had followed her somehow, that he knew where she lived, that he was waiting for an opportunity. Jessica had tried to be supportive, but the strain had been too much. Within 3 months, she'd moved out, gently suggesting that Maya needed professional help that Jessica wasn't qualified to provide. Maya's parents had tried to help, had paid for therapy, had encouraged her to take time off from work, but Maya had been unable to articulate what she'd experienced in a way that sounded credible, even to herself. Her photography career had faltered. The portfolio she'd been working on remained unfinished, the images from Whisper Lake too psychologically fraught to edit or display. Gallery contacts had gone unanswered. Assignments had been turned down. Within a year, she'd stopped calling herself a photographer and had taken a job as a barista at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, work that was simple, routine, safe, and then she'd disappeared. The official timeline was sparse and troubling. On March 7, 2013, 14 months after her experience at Whisper Lake, Maya Thornton had left her apartment in Denver around 9 in the morning. Her roommate at the time, a graduate student named Amanda Chen, had been in class and hadn't seen her leave. Neighbors reported seeing Maya get into her Subaru and drive away. Nothing unusual about her demeanor or behavior. She'd been expected at work for the afternoon shift at the coffee shop, but she'd never arrived. When she didn't show up and didn't call, the manager had tried her cell phone multiple times without success. By evening, Amanda had returned home to find Maya's apartment door unlocked, her bed unmade, her phone sitting on the kitchen counter. Maya's car had been found 3 days later in the parking lot of a trailhead near Golden, Colorado, about 15 miles west of Denver. The vehicle was locked, keys in the ignition, gas tank still half full. Her purse was in the car, wallet intact with cash and credit cards. Her driver's license was there, her insurance card, everything you'd expect to find. But Maya was gone. The trail near where her car was found led up into the foothills, a moderate hike popular with locals. Search teams had combed the area for days, expanding the radius with each passing hour, but they'd found no trace of her. No clothing, no camping gear, no indication she'd gone hiking at all. It was as if she'd parked the car, stepped out, and evaporated. The investigation had considered multiple theories. Suicide, though there was no note, and Maya's therapist reported she hadn't been expressing suicidal ideation. Voluntary disappearance, though she'd left behind everything, including her phone and wallet, and there was no evidence of planning. Foul play, though there were no signs of struggle, no witnesses reporting anything suspicious, no suspects. The case had generated some media attention, particularly because of Maya's previous experience at Whisper Lake. Journalists had drawn connections, had suggested that perhaps her paranoia hadn't been unfounded, that perhaps whoever had terrorized her at the cabin had found her in Denver, had been stalking her for over a year, waiting for an opportunity. But police had found no evidence to support this theory. No stalking reports from Maya or anyone who knew her. No suspicious individuals caught on surveillance footage. No threats, no harassment. Nothing beyond Maya's own psychological trauma from the cabin incident. Her parents, David and Ellen Thornton, both retired professors from the University of Colorado, had been devastated. They'd hired a private investigator, had offered a reward initially $10,000, then increased to $25,000, had appeared on television pleading for information. But nothing had generated useful leads. Maya Thornton had simply vanished, and her case had gone cold. Until February 2019, when two brothers on snowmobiles had found her messenger bag frozen into the snow in the Roosevelt National Forest, nearly 7 years after she'd disappeared. Detective Ethan Cross had been assigned to reopen the case, and he'd approached it with the methodical thoroughness that had made him one of the most respected investigators in the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. He'd requested every piece of documentation from both the original Whisper Lake incident in 2012 and Maya's disappearance in 2013, and he'd spent weeks reading through everything, looking for connections, patterns, anything that might have been missed. The discovery location of the messenger bag was significant. The Roosevelt National Forest covered hundreds of square miles, but the specific location where the Toth brothers had found the bag was only about 12 miles as the crow flies from Whisper Lake. Not adjacent to it, but close enough to suggest a connection. The bag had been found in a drainage area, a place where runoff from snowmelt would naturally accumulate, which meant it could have washed down from somewhere higher in the mountains. Cross had organized a search of the area surrounding the discovery site, and this time they'd had the benefit of improved technology. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs with better training, drones equipped with thermal imaging, and high-resolution cameras. The search had lasted for 3 weeks, covering a 5-mile radius, examining every gully, every ravine, every potential concealment site. And they'd found something. On the 14th day of the search, one of the cadaver dogs had alerted near a collapsed mine shaft, about 2 miles from where the messenger bag had been discovered. The mine was old, probably dating back to the gold rush era of the late 1800s, long since abandoned and partially filled in by decades of erosion and rockfall. The search team had carefully excavated the entrance, and 20 feet into the shaft, buried under rocks and debris, they'd found human remains. The skeleton was largely intact, though scattered by animal activity and the collapse of the mine structure. Forensic anthropologists from the University of Colorado had been brought in to assist with recovery and analysis, and within days they'd made a preliminary identification based on dental records. The remains were Maya Thornton. The discovery had made national news. The photographer who'd vanished 7 years earlier, whose case had become a minor mystery in true crime circles, had been found in a mine shaft in the mountains she'd loved and feared. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined due to the condition of the remains, but forensic analysis revealed several significant findings. Maya's ankle, the one she'd injured during her escape attempt from the cabin, showed evidence of the old sprain, confirming this was indeed her. But the skeleton also showed evidence of more recent trauma. Multiple ribs had been broken peri-mortem, around the time of death. There were fractures to the left ulna and radius, the bones of the forearm, consistent with defensive wounds. And most significantly, there was a depressed fracture on the right parietal bone of the skull, the kind of injury that typically results from blunt force trauma. In other words, Maya had been attacked. She'd fought back, sustaining defensive injuries, and she'd suffered a blow to the head that had likely killed her or incapacitated her enough that she'd been unable to save herself. This was not an accidental death. This was not suicide. This was homicide. Detective Cross had immediately shifted the investigation's focus. The question was no longer what had happened to Maya Thornton, but who had killed her, and why. And the most likely answer seemed to be connected to Whisper Lake, to the cabin, to the week she'd spent being terrorized by an unknown individual. Cross had returned to the original investigation files, had reread every witness statement, had examined every piece of evidence with fresh eyes, and he'd noticed something that had been overlooked in the original investigation, or perhaps hadn't seemed significant at the time. When Maya had been treated at the hospital in Loveland after her escape from the cabin, the attending physician had documented all of her injuries. The sprained ankle, obviously, some bruising on her arms and legs from her fall, dehydration, exhaustion. But there'd also been a note about scratches on her back, superficial but numerous, in a pattern that the physician had documented as consistent with being dragged or pulled across rough surface. Cross had obtained the hospital records and had examined the photographs taken as part of Maya's medical documentation. The scratches were there, faint but visible, and they didn't look like something that would result from normal outdoor activity. They looked like someone had grabbed her, had pulled her backward, had dragged her across something rough, which meant that at some point during her time at the cabin, possibly during her attempted walk to town, someone had physically assaulted her. She'd managed to get away, had made it back to the cabin, had eventually escaped in her car, but the attack had happened. It hadn't been just psychological terror. Someone had put their hands on her. Cross had also found something else in the files. A brief mention in one of the deputy's reports that when they'd searched the cabin after Maya's escape, they'd found scratches on the exterior walls, long gouges in the wood siding that appeared fresh. The deputy had photographed them but hadn't attached much significance to them at the time, assuming they were from an animal or from branches scraping against the building. But looking at the photographs now, Cross could see that the scratches were too regular, too deliberate to be natural. They were exactly what Maya had described. Someone dragging something, a stick or a tool, along the walls of the cabin in a pattern designed to terrorize. Someone had been there. Someone had done exactly what Maya claimed. And 7 years later, her body had been found in a mine shaft with evidence of homicide. Cross had expanded his investigation to focus on identifying the man in the truck, the one Maya had described seeing on her last day at the cabin. He'd interviewed Victor Ashford extensively, pressing him for any information about who might have been on the property. Ashford had maintained that he didn't know, that he rarely saw other people up there in winter, that the roads were shared access and technically anyone could use them. But Cross had kept digging. He'd pulled property records for the entire area surrounding Whisper Lake, identifying every landowner, every person who might have legitimate reason to be on those roads. He'd cross-referenced those names against criminal databases, looking for anyone with a history of violence, particularly violence against women. And he'd found a name that made everything click into place. Raymond Voss, age 57 in 2012, would be 64 now. Owner of a 40-acre parcel adjacent to Victor Ashford's property, accessible by the same Forest Service road. Voss had a history, not extensive but concerning. A domestic violence arrest in 1993, charges dropped when the victim recanted. A restraining order filed by a former girlfriend in 2004, expired after 2 years. A complaint from a neighbor in 2008 claiming Voss had threatened her, investigated but no charges filed. Nothing that would necessarily flag him as a murderer, but a pattern of behavior toward women that suggested control issues, potential violence, an inability to respect boundaries. Cross had driven up to Whisper Lake on a cold March morning, 7 years almost to the day since Maya's body had been placed in that mine shaft, and he'd located Voss's property. It was remote, even more so than Ashford's cabins, accessible by a rough track that required serious four-wheel drive. The house was a small structure, more of a cabin really, surrounded by vehicles in various states of disrepair. Trucks, mostly, several of them dark blue or black. Cross had approached with backup, 2 deputies and a state trooper, just in case. They'd knocked on the door, had identified themselves as law enforcement and had requested to speak with Raymond Voss. The man who'd answered the door matched Maya's description from 7 years earlier. Tall, bulky, weathered face, mid-50s appearance, though he'd now be in his 60s. He'd been polite, cooperative even, had invited them inside without hesitation. The interior of the cabin was cluttered, but not filthy. The space of someone who lived alone and didn't care much about aesthetics. Hunting trophies on the walls, elk and deer mostly. A gun cabinet visible in the corner, locked. Stacks of outdoor magazines and books about wilderness survival. Cross had explained they were investigating the death of Maya Thornton, had shown Voss a photograph of her, had asked if he recognized her. Voss had looked at the photo for a long moment, then had shaken his head. "Don't think so. Should I?" She rented a cabin from Victor Ashford in January 2012, on the eastern shore of Whisper Lake. She reported being harassed during her stay, and 7 years later her body was found in a mine shaft about 12 miles from here. "We have reason to believe you may have seen her during that time." Voss had shrugged. "I see lots of people coming and going from Vic's cabins. Can't say I remember anyone specifically from 7 years ago." She described seeing a man in a dark truck on her last day at the cabin. Cross had continued, watching Voss's face carefully. Said the man got out with an axe, chopped some firewood, then left. "That sound like something you might have done?" "I chop firewood all the time," Voss had said. "It's how I heat this place. Could have been me, could have been anyone. There are lots of people up here who gather wood." "But not many who use Ashford's access road," Cross had pressed. "Not many who would have been on that specific road during that specific time period." Voss had leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting slightly. Not quite defensive, but more guarded. "Detective, I don't know what you think I did, but I'm just a guy who lives in the mountains and minds his own business. If this woman had some kind of bad experience up here, that's unfortunate. But it's got nothing to do with me." Cross had tried different approaches, had asked about Voss's movements in January 2012, in March 2013, had asked if he owned weapons, if he'd ever been inside Ashford's cabins, if he knew where the old mine shafts in the area were located. Voss had answered every question with maddening vagueness, never quite lying, but never quite telling the truth either. And without physical evidence connecting Voss to Maya's murder, Cross had no grounds for an arrest. No witnesses placing them together. No DNA. Not after 7 years of decomposition and exposure. No murder weapon. Nothing but circumstantial evidence and Cross's gut instinct telling him that Raymond Voss knew exactly what had happened to Maya Thornton because Raymond Voss had made it happen. The interview had ended without resolution. Voss had shown them out politely, had even wished them luck with their investigation. As Cross had walked back to his vehicle, he'd turned and looked back at the cabin. Voss had been standing in the window, watching them leave, his expression unreadable. Cross had returned to his office frustrated, but not defeated. He'd known that solving cold cases often required patience, persistence, and sometimes just waiting for a break. He'd continued working the case, had interviewed Maya's friends and family again, had tried to trace her movements in the 14 months between her escape from Whisper Lake and her disappearance in March 2013. And slowly, a picture had begun to emerge. Maya hadn't just been traumatized by her experience at the cabin. She'd been convinced, absolutely certain, that whoever had terrorized her there was still watching her, still hunting her. She'd told her therapist this repeatedly, had described feeling followed, observed, even though she could never point to concrete evidence. Her parents had believed she was suffering from PTSD, that her paranoia was a symptom of psychological trauma rather than actual danger. Her friends had tried to be supportive, but had gradually distanced themselves when Maya's fear had become too intense, too all-consuming. Even Jessica, her former roommate who'd tried hard to help, had eventually concluded that Maya needed more help than friends could provide. But what if Maya had been right? What if she hadn't been paranoid? What if Raymond Voss, or whoever had been at Whisper Lake, had indeed followed her back to Denver, had spent 14 months watching her, learning her patterns, waiting for an opportunity? Cross had pulled surveillance footage from locations Maya had frequented in the months before her disappearance: the coffee shop where she'd worked, the grocery store where she'd shopped, the library where she'd spent hours reading because being in public spaces made her feel safer than being alone in her apartment. Hours and hours of footage, and Cross had watched all of it, looking for anyone who appeared repeatedly, anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to Maya, anyone who fit Voss's description. And he'd found something. In footage from a grocery store parking lot dated February 20th, 2013, 2 weeks before Maya's disappearance, there was a dark blue truck. The footage was grainy, the angle wasn't optimal, but Cross could make out a male driver sitting in the vehicle, apparently waiting. The timestamp showed he'd been there for 43 minutes before Maya had emerged from the store with her groceries. As Maya had walked to her car, the truck had started moving, had exited the parking lot at the same time she did, had followed her onto the street. The footage ended there, but it was enough to establish that someone in a truck matching the description of Voss's vehicles had been watching Maya, had followed her. Cross had taken this evidence to the district attorney, had argued for a warrant to search Voss's property, to examine his vehicles, to pull his phone records and financial documents for the relevant time periods. But the DA had been hesitant. The footage was circumstantial, couldn't definitively identify the driver. Dark blue trucks were common, and even if they could prove Voss had been in Denver, that didn't prove he'd killed Maya. "Get me more," the DA had said. "Get me something concrete that ties him to her death, and I'll authorize a warrant. But what you have right now isn't enough for a conviction, and if we move too soon, we might spook him into destroying evidence." So Cross had kept investigating. He'd driven up to Whisper Lake again, this time to search for the mine shaft where Maya's body had been found. It was remote, difficult to access, the kind of place you'd only know about if you were intimately familiar with the area. Cross had examined the site carefully, had tried to understand how Maya's body had ended up there. The most likely scenario was that she'd been killed elsewhere, probably not far away, and her body had been transported to the mine shaft for concealment. The injuries she'd sustained, the broken ribs and defensive wounds, suggested a struggle that had taken place in a confined space, possibly inside a vehicle. The head injury had likely been the fatal blow, delivered with something heavy and blunt. Cross had worked with forensic specialists to create a timeline. Based on the condition of the remains and the environmental factors, they'd estimated Maya had died within days of her disappearance in March 2013. So whoever had taken her from that trailhead parking lot had likely killed her relatively quickly, then had driven her body up into the mountains, had carried or dragged her to the mine shaft, and had concealed her there. It would have required strength, certainly, but also local knowledge. You'd need to know those mountains intimately to navigate to such a remote location, to know where the old mine shafts were, to understand how to access them. Raymond Voss, who'd lived in the area for decades, who spent his time hunting and gathering firewood in those forests, would have exactly that kind of knowledge. Cross had also discovered something else. In going through old sheriff's department files, he'd found reports of other women who'd rented Ashford's cabins over the years and who'd reported strange experiences. Not as dramatic as Maya's, but concerning nonetheless. A woman in 2009 who'd reported hearing someone outside her cabin at night, footsteps that had circled the building before disappearing. She'd left early, had told Ashford she'd been too frightened to stay. Another woman in 2007 who'd reported finding her car's distributor cap removed, stranding her at the cabin for an extra 2 days until Ashford had come to check on her and had helped her fix it. She'd assumed it had been an animal or a mechanical failure, but looking back, the removal of a distributor cap wasn't something that happened accidentally. A woman in 2005 who'd reported seeing a man watching her cabin from the tree line, someone who'd disappeared when she'd tried to approach. She'd described him as tall, bulky, wearing hunting camouflage. These reports had been filed, documented, but never investigated as a pattern because the women had all eventually left safely, because no crimes had been committed, because it had seemed like isolated incidents rather than connected events. But Cross saw the pattern now. Someone had been targeting women who stayed alone at those cabins, had been harassing them, terrorizing them, testing boundaries. Most of the women had left quickly, frightened but unharmed. But Maya had been different. Maya had been trapped by weather and injury, had been unable to leave, and whatever game the perpetrator had been playing had escalated into something more dangerous. Cross had tracked down and interviewed the other women, now scattered across the country. Each conversation had been difficult, bringing up traumatic memories they'd tried to forget. But each woman had confirmed their experiences, had provided details that were remarkably consistent with Maya's account. Footsteps at night, the feeling of being watched, small acts of sabotage that seemed designed to isolate and frighten rather than to cause immediate harm. 2 of the women, when shown photographs, had tentatively identified Raymond Voss as resembling the man they'd seen, though they couldn't be certain after so many years. It wasn't enough for a criminal charge, but it was enough to establish a pattern of behavior. Cross had returned to Voss's property in late summer of 2019, this time with a different approach. Instead of confronting Voss directly, he'd conducted surveillance, had watched the property from a distance, had documented Voss's movements and routines. What he'd observed had been interesting. Voss lived alone, rarely had visitors, spent most of his time working on his vehicles or walking through the forest surrounding his property. He made trips into Ridgefield every week or 2 for supplies, always alone, always keeping to himself. He didn't seem to have friends or social connections, didn't participate in the community activities that helped small mountain towns function. But Cross had also noticed something else. Several times over the course of his surveillance, Voss had driven to the area near where Maya's body had been found. Not to the exact location, but close enough to be significant. He'd park his truck, would walk into the forest carrying binoculars and a camera, ostensibly birdwatching or photography. But he'd always end up in the same general area, would spend time there, would seem to be revisiting a place that held significance for him. It was a behavior Cross had seen before in killers who'd concealed bodies. They couldn't stay away. They needed to return to the site, to verify that the concealment was still secure, to relive what they'd done. It was compulsive, psychological, and often it was what eventually led to their capture. Cross had tried to get authorization for more intensive surveillance, for phone taps and GPS tracking, but again the DA had hesitated. The evidence was still too circumstantial. They needed something definitive, something that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. That something had come in October 2019, when a hiker had found a camera in the forest, about half a mile from Voss's property. It was an old digital camera, weather-damaged and non-functional. But when the hiker had turned it in to authorities and Cross had managed to recover data from the memory card, he'd found something significant. Photographs. Dozens of them. All taken in the area around Whisper Lake, all focused on the cabins, on the access roads, on the clearings where someone at the cabin would have to walk if they ventured outside. The timestamps on the photos ranged from 2004 through 2012, a span of 8 years documenting what looked like surveillance of Ashford's rental properties. And in several of the photos, women were visible. Women who'd rented the cabins, captured in images that showed them arriving, unpacking, walking near their vehicles, visible through cabin windows. The photos had been taken from concealed positions in the forest, using a telephoto lens, without the knowledge or consent of the subjects. One series of photos from January 2012 showed Maya Thornton. More than a dozen images of her, arriving at the cabin, unloading her car, standing at the window with her camera, walking near the lake. The final photo in the series showed her car with the hood open, clearly taken after the battery cable had been disconnected. Cross had felt his pulse quicken as he'd reviewed these images. This was evidence of stalking, of premeditation, of someone systematically targeting and surveilling these women. And the camera had been found near Voss's property, suggesting it belonged to him or had been used by him. The discovery had finally been enough. The DA had authorized a search warrant for Voss's property, his vehicles, his electronic devices. On November 4, 2019, Cross had returned to Voss's cabin with a full team, multiple vehicles, a judge's signature giving them authority to search every inch of the property. Voss had been home when they'd arrived. He'd stood in his doorway, arms crossed, watching with an expression that might have been anger or might have been resignation as Cross had served him with the warrant. "This is harassment," Voss had said. "You've got nothing on me." "We'll let the evidence speak for itself," Cross had replied. The search had taken 2 days. The team had been methodical, photographing everything, bagging and tagging anything that might be relevant. They'd found multiple cameras, including one that matched the make and model of the camera found by the hiker. They'd found binoculars, telephoto lenses, dozens of memory cards containing thousands of images, many of them showing the cabins and the surrounding area. They'd found maps marked with locations, including notations near where Maya's body had been discovered. They'd found newspaper clippings about Maya's disappearance, about the search efforts, about her parents' pleas for information. They'd found a notebook containing what appeared to be surveillance logs, dates and times and brief descriptions of activity observed at the cabins. And in the back of one of Voss's trucks, despite his efforts to clean it, they'd found traces of blood. Not much, just microscopic amounts in seams and crevices where cleaning couldn't reach. But enough for DNA testing. The testing had taken weeks. Cross had waited impatiently, knowing that if the blood was Maya's, they'd have physical evidence connecting Voss to her death. If it wasn't, they'd still have the stalking evidence, but proving murder would be much more difficult. The results had come back in early December. The blood was Maya Thornton's, DNA match with a certainty of 99.9%. Raymond Voss had been arrested on December 9, 2019, and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Maya Thornton, along with multiple counts of stalking related to other women who'd rented the cabins. The trial had taken place in the summer of 2020, delayed slightly by the pandemic, but ultimately proceeding with modified courtroom procedures. The prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence. The photographs, the surveillance logs, the blood in Voss's truck, the testimony of women who'd been harassed at the cabins, the forensic evidence from Maya's remains showing homicide. The defense had argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the blood could have been transferred innocently, that taking photographs wasn't a crime, that Voss was a recluse who liked his privacy and might have seemed suspicious, but wasn't a murderer. But the jury hadn't been convinced. After 3 days of deliberation, they'd returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. At his sentencing, Voss had been given an opportunity to speak. He'd stood, had looked directly at Maya's parents, who were sitting in the front row of the courtroom, and he'd said something that had chilled everyone present. She shouldn't have been up there alone. Women who go into the wilderness alone are asking for trouble. They need to learn that actions have consequences. It wasn't quite a confession, but it was close enough. It revealed the twisted logic that had driven him, the belief that he had some kind of right to punish women for daring to seek solitude, to exist without male protection or supervision. The judge had sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. Maya's parents, David and Ellen Thornton, had held a press conference after the sentencing. Ellen had spoken through tears, thanking Detective Cross and the entire investigative team for never giving up, for believing that Maya's story mattered, for working tirelessly to find the truth. Maya was a beautiful, talented young woman who loved the wilderness, Ellen had said. She went to Whisper Lake to create art, to connect with nature, to find peace. Instead, she found a monster. But that monster doesn't get to write the ending of her story. We do. And we're going to make sure that Maya is remembered for her art, her kindness, her courage, not for how she died, but for how she lived. The Thornton family had established a foundation in Maya's name, providing funding for wilderness safety education, supporting programs that helped women develop outdoor skills and confidence, advocating for better emergency communication systems in remote areas. They'd donated Maya's photographs, including the haunting images from Whisper Lake, to the Colorado Museum of Art, where they'd been displayed in an exhibition titled Solitude and Survival: The Art of Maya Thornton. The exhibition had traveled to galleries across the country, and Maya's work had finally received the recognition she'd been seeking when she'd driven up to that remote cabin in January 2012. The photographs were stunning, black and white images that captured both the beauty and the menace of winter wilderness, light and shadow, isolation and presence. Detective Cross had attended the exhibition's opening in Denver. He'd walked through the gallery, studying each photograph, remembering the case, the search, the moment when Maya's body had been discovered and a 7-year mystery had finally begun to unravel. One photograph in particular had stayed with him. It showed the cabin at Whisper Lake at dusk, light glowing from the windows, smoke rising from the chimney, surrounded by snow and trees and encroaching darkness. It looked peaceful, inviting even, a sanctuary from the cold. But knowing what Cross knew about what had happened there, the image took on a different quality. The darkness seemed less peaceful and more predatory. The isolation less romantic and more dangerous. The photograph had been titled Before, and Cross understood the significance. Before Maya had heard the footsteps. Before she'd known she was being hunted. Before everything had changed. There should have been a photograph titled After, but of course there couldn't be. After was terror and flight and injury and ultimately death in a mine shaft. 7 years of a family not knowing. 7 years of a killer walking free. Cross had spent 30 years in law enforcement, had worked hundreds of cases, and he knew that not every case ended with justice. But this one had, eventually, and he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before moving on to the next file, the next victim waiting for someone to rise enough to find the truth. Maya Thornton's case had been solved, but questions remained. How many other women had Voss targeted over the years? The photographs in his possession suggested dozens, maybe more. How many had left frightened but unharmed? How many had reported their experiences only to be dismissed as paranoid or overreacting? And were there others, besides Maya, who hadn't escaped? The investigation had expanded to examine other missing persons cases in northern Colorado dating back decades, looking for any connection to Voss or the Whisper Lake area. Several cases had been identified as potentially related. Women who disappeared after visiting the mountains, whose cases had gone cold, whose families still waited for answers. As of the making of this investigation, those cases remain open. Voss has refused to cooperate, has refused to provide any information about his activities over the years, has maintained that Maya's death was the only time his surveillance had turned violent, which investigators don't believe. The cabins at Whisper Lake stand empty now. Victor Ashford, horrified by what had happened on his property, had stopped renting them. He'd considered tearing them down, but ultimately had decided to leave them standing as a kind of memorial, a reminder that evil can exist even in the most beautiful places, that isolation can be dangerous, that women have a right to exist in wilderness without fear, but that right must be protected, not assumed. The forest has reclaimed much of the clearing around the cabins. Snow still falls each winter, covering the landscape in white silence. The lake still freezes solid, creating the patterns that Maya had wanted to photograph. And sometimes, hikers passing through the area report feeling watched, sensing a presence in the trees, hearing sounds that might be footsteps or might be wind, might be wildlife or might be something else. Whether those reports reflect actual danger or simply the psychological weight of knowing what happened there, no one can say for certain. But the story of Maya Thornton has become a cautionary tale, told around campfires and in online forums devoted to true crime, a reminder that monsters are real and that they don't always look like monsters. They look like ordinary men living in remote cabins, men who believe that women who seek solitude deserve to be punished for their audacity. This has been the story of Maya Thornton, a 29-year-old photographer who traveled to Whisper Lake in January 2012 seeking inspiration and found instead a nightmare that would ultimately cost her life. Her story is tragic, infuriating, and unfortunately not unique. Every year, women are targeted for violence simply because they exist in spaces that some men believe they shouldn't occupy. Every year, their warnings are dismissed as paranoia until it's too late. But Maya's story is also one of persistence, of Detective Ethan Cross refusing to let her case remain cold, of forensic scientists and search teams working tirelessly to find answers, of a family that never stopped believing their daughter deserved justice. It's a story about how long justice can take, but also about how it can eventually prevail. If this case has affected you, if you believe that Maya's story deserves to be remembered and that other cold cases deserve the same dedication that Detective Cross showed, I need you to do something for me right now. Share this video with someone who cares about true crime, someone who believes that victims deserve advocates, someone who understands that cold cases are only cold until someone cares enough to warm them up again. And in the comments, tell me which unsolved case you think we should investigate next. Your engagement keeps these stories alive, reminds law enforcement that people are still watching and still demanding answers. and honors the memory of victims like Maya, who deserve so much more than to be forgotten. Thank you for being here, for listening, for caring. This is Cold Case Crimson, and I'll see you in the next investigation.